Even now, when I pass through the college gates on certain late afternoons, I feel the same quiet narrowing of the heart. The air smells of stone, dust, and lilac, the particular perfume of Oxford in early summer. That day, the light had fallen through the cloisters like honey poured through a sieve, slow and uneven, as though uncertain of its own purpose. I remember sitting alone on the worn bench beside the sundial, the pigeons picking crumbs from the gravel, my knees aching from too long a stillness. I had a book with me, Don, I think, but it lay unopened on my lap. Reading, like so much else in life, requires a belief in future comprehension, and I was not in that sort of mood. Somewhere beyond the chapel wall, a choir rehearsed Bird's Ave Verum Corpus. The melody hovered like mist above the quadrangle, too perfect to last. It was then I heard Lewis's footsteps, deliberate, hesitant, carrying the reluctant rhythm of unwelcome news. He stopped before me and spoke in that careful way of his, as if trying not to disturb my silence more than duty required. "A death," he said, "a professor at Corpus Christi, found locked in his room that morning. The porter thought it odd he hadn't come down for chapel. He'd been a punctual man." I rose without comment, brushing the dust from my coat. The word corpus lingered curiously in the air between us, not just the college, but the body itself. Oxford loves a pun almost as much as it fears mortality. The porter led us through the courtyard and up the narrow staircase that smelled of candle grease and old port. A cat darted past, startled by our arrival, its tail brushing my ankle. The rooms were modest bookshelves bowed with age, a Persian rug faded to memory, and a gramophone whose needle had stopped mid-phrase. The Professor Elwyn Charnock, I later learned, was seated at his desk, head resting gently on his sleeve as though he had drifted into an untroubled nap. Only the stillness betrayed him. Lewis murmured something about suicide. I nodded but said nothing. There was a serenity in the arrangement that troubled me more than violence would have. Beside the professor's hand lay a crossword, half complete. The clue at its centre read, "Corpus the body or the truth?" A cross-intersected betrayal. An odd pairing, I thought, for a mind now beyond deceit. The bursar arrived soon after, eager to contribute facts. Charnock had been preparing a paper for the founder's lecture, something about a rediscovered Latin manuscript, the Corpus Riddle. There had been disagreements about its translation, even whispers of plagiarism, academic quarrels, petty and poisonous. I've long believed that the most genteel places produce the subtlest cruelties. As he spoke, I wandered to the window. Outside, the quadrangle shimmered with evening light. Students in gowns drifted toward the hall, laughing, unaware. A breeze lifted a corner of the crossword, revealing a smudge beneath a faint thumbprint of ink, or perhaps sweat. I couldn't tell which. Beneath the puzzle lay a note written in Latin, the hand neat but hurried. The translation, as far as my schoolboy Latin allowed, suggested contrition. Yet one line was wrong, a mistranslation of Ovid, if memory serves. A deliberate error, perhaps, or a cry for correction. Lewis was inspecting the lock on the inner door. Secure, undamaged, the only key found in the pocket of the deceased. It looked like suicide, yes, but felt like performance. The room whispered of arrangement rather than accident. I have learned to distrust any death too artfully composed. As we left, the porter crossed himself discreetly, and the choir's hymn drifted faintly once more through the open window. The refrain hung on a single Latin word, verum, truth. Later, over whiskey at the Randolph, Lewis tried to cheer me with practicalities, statements, reports, times of death, but my thoughts kept returning to that crossword, to the question that had outlived its maker. Corpus, the body, or the truth? Oxford, I reflected, would always prefer the latter. but it is the former, the body, the mortal evidence that never lies. There is a kind of silence peculiar to Oxford rooms after death, a stillness made of dust and withheld breath. When I entered Charnock's study that evening, I felt it at once, the hush of a space no longer belonging to the living. The air was thick with the scent of old vellum and extinguished candles. Lewis stood awkwardly near the door, his hat in his hands, uncertain whether to speak or genuflect. The light from the single window had the weary pallor of late afternoon. Charnock's desk was crowded with papers, lexicons, marginalia, a bottle of port half drained. On the floor lay an overturned chair, too neatly toppled to be an accident. I bent to right it, then stopped. The edge of one leg was freshly chipped, as though it had been pressed hard against something immovable. Lewis said quietly that the doctor estimated death at around midnight. He pointed to the empty glass beside the inkwell. I noted the faint crystallization around the rim residue of something sweetened, perhaps. Not enough for a conclusion, but enough for a question. I have always distrusted rooms that try to tell their own stories. This one was loud in its orderliness, the pens aligned, the blotter square, the clock wound to the exact minute. Yet a single envelope rested half-hidden beneath a folio, its seal broken, its contents missing. A scrap of parchment remained, with the faintest trace of red wax, shaped like a crescent moon. Lewis leaned over my shoulder, muttering that it looked like a scholar's eccentricity. I thought otherwise. Eccentricity leaves clutter, and fear leaves arrangement. The bed had not been slept in. On the nightstand a copy of Ovid's Metamorphoses lay open, at the tail of Narcissus. The page bore a dark smudge where a thumb might have lingered. I imagined Charnock sitting there, translating, his pulse slowing, perhaps reciting the lines to himself about reflection and death. But the Latin had been annotated in two hands, one flowing, one angular. I traced the latter with my finger. The ink was still faintly tacky. Someone else had been here not long before the body was found. The porter confirmed that the study door had been locked from within. The only key was found in the professor's pocket. A window latch, however, bore a minute scratch, recently made. It could have meant nothing. It could have meant entry. While Lewis took statements, I examined the crossword once more. That curious intersection, corpus and betrayal, refused to leave me in peace. Charnock had always been fond of wordplay. Perhaps he had left a final jest. Yet the symmetry of the clues unsettled me. The down clue, corpus the body or the truth, had been answered with verum. The cross clue, faith undone, had been filled with trust. Neither word fit perfectly in the grid, and both were written in a hand slightly shakier than the rest. Lewis asked if I thought the professor had poisoned himself. I told him I thought too much care had been taken to make it appear so. He frowned, said that was not much of a deduction. Perhaps not, I replied, but deduction often begins where tidiness offends the eye. Before leaving, I turned once more toward the window. From the quadrangle below drifted the sound of young laughter students spilling from the hall, unaware of the death above them. A bell tolled the quarter. I remember thinking how Oxford holds its tragedies quietly, folding them between rituals like bookmarks in an ancient text. As we stepped back into the corridor, the floorboards sighed under our weight. Lewis closed the door behind us, and the latch clicked with a softness that felt final. He asked if I believed in coincidence. I told him only when it refused to be useful. That night, unable to sleep, I opened Charnock's copy of Ovid again in my mind. The line he had marked returned to me, pale and insistent. He knew not that what he saw was himself. I poured another measure of whisky and sat by the window until dawn, wondering if every death in Oxford is merely another reflection, one more image in the long, dark glass of scholarship, gazing at itself until it forgets to breathe. The invitation had arrived on cream paper embossed with the college crest and faintly scented with lavender, as if someone had pressed it between old hymnals. I had not intended to go, yet by late afternoon I found myself walking toward the lawns of Corpus Christi, the sound of a string quartet floating out across the air like an afterthought. Oxford, when it dresses itself for celebration, has the air of a mourner pretending gaiety. The garden was a theatre of civility. Men in tweed jackets balanced sherry glasses, women in hats smiled with the precision of clockwork. Beneath the laughter I sensed unease, the polite restraint that gathers when guilt is close but unnamed. Lewis stood beside the sandwich table, glancing with suspicion at a quiche. He said something about the privilege of watching the upper classes mourn through canapé, and I almost smiled. It was there I first observed Harriet Vane. She was standing near the rose arch, the sun behind her. The colour of the petals caught faintly in her hair. There was nothing sentimental about her, though she had the kind of beauty that made other women defensive. She spoke little, and when she did, her words seemed chosen less for precision than protection. She was the late Professor Charnock's former lover, so the bursar whispered, and a scholar of Greek tragedy, a discipline that must have seemed less theoretical now. When I approached her, she regarded me with the slight impatience of a person already accustomed to suspicion. She said she had not seen Charnock in weeks. Then a pause, long enough to matter. Not since the day he asked about the manuscript, she added. I asked which one. She looked toward the chapel, where the choir boys were laughing at something too coarse for their robes, and said softly, "The one that was meant to outlive him." I let the words settle. Harriet had the disconcerting habit of answering questions before they were asked, and of leaving them unfinished. She spoke of a quarrel between Charnock and Sir Adrian Fox, the publisher. Charnock had accused him of coercion, though no one knew why. Later, when I found Sir Adrian by the punch bowl, he denied everything with an eloquence too swift to be innocent. He claimed that Charnock's lecture would have discredited half the college, himself included, had it been delivered. As the light thinned, the quartet changed to something livelier, though the mood of the gathering refused to follow. Reverend Gwilym, the chaplain, appeared beside me. He smelt faintly of incense and wine, and his eyes had that sorrowful brightness peculiar to those who love sin more than doctrine. He muttered that Charnock had lately become obsessed with death and had spoken of confession, of truth, of God's Latin. Then he added, with a tremor that betrayed belief, that Charnock's final paper had been meant as a warning. I remember looking across the garden then toward Harriet. She was lighting a cigarette, though the wind threatened to undo her effort. When the flame finally caught, she cupped it carefully with both hands and inhaled. It struck me absurdly that the gesture was too deliberate, as though she were teaching herself calm. Lewis interrupted my thought with news that the pathologist had confirmed traces of port and something bitter in Charnock's stomach. He said it loudly enough for the bursar to overhear, which of course was the point. Within minutes, the garden's conversation shifted from scholarship to scandal. I did not stop him. Gossip, when properly directed, can be the purest form of interrogation. As we left, the bells of the chapel began to toll, though no service was due. The sound echoed through the courtyard, uncertain, almost embarrassed. Lewis said it was probably a mechanical error. I doubted it. Oxford's machines rarely fail by accident. Later that night, when I walked past the same rose arch, I noticed a small object half buried in the grass, a silver lighter engraved with a Greek letter, delta. It still held the faint warmth of a recent flame. I slipped it into my pocket and stood for a moment in the empty garden, listening to the silence that followed the ceremony. Somewhere behind the darkened windows, music still played. It was not Bird this time, but Schubert, the slow movement of a string quintet, trembling with a sadness too articulate to name. I thought again of Harriet Vane's unspoken pause and of the lighter in my hand, still faintly warm. It was not proof of anything, of course. Proof never announces itself so soon. But it was perhaps the first small syllable of truth. The Bodleian has always struck me as both sanctuary and sepulchre, an archive of lives once urgent, now reduced to margins and dust. That morning, the rain had turned Oxford into a blurred engraving, its edges softened, its certainties dampened. I went there not for revelation, but for something quieter, the comfort of ink and silence. Lewis was less reverent. He grumbled about the smell, the cold, the absurdity of hunting meaning in a library when a man had died 3 nights prior. I told him that most murders begin with a sentence, often an unfinished one. He muttered something about my taste for poetry over evidence, but followed nonetheless. Charnock's desk awaited us in the restricted reading room, the same one reserved for manuscripts deemed too fragile or too secret for casual scholarship. The librarian, a thin woman with spectacles shaped like commas, informed us that he had been working on the so-called Corpus Riddle, a 15th century text, whose authorship, she said, was as disputed as its meaning. She mentioned, with the faint tremor of professional gossip, that a page was missing from the folio. I asked when it had last been seen. She hesitated, then said that the professor had requested the manuscript the evening before his death. He had signed it out himself. I asked to see the register. The page bore Charnock's name, the familiar angular signature, but the ink was wrong, too pale, too recent. When I touched it lightly, it smudged, not ink at all, but modern toner, a photocopy of a signature. The forgery was as clumsy as it was clever. Whoever made it assumed reverence would prevent scrutiny. Lewis raised an eyebrow when I pointed it out. He said, "So someone wanted it to seem like he'd been here later than he was." I nodded, or earlier, depending on what needed proving. "Time is flexible in Oxford," I said. "It bends to ambition." The librarian, now uneasy, recalled a brief quarrel the night before between Charnock and Sir Adrian Fox, the publisher. She had overheard the words, ownership and authenticity. Charnock had left abruptly, leaving his scarf behind. Fox returned later, requesting to see the manuscript himself. She refused him entry. He had smiled, she said, and remarked that knowledge cannot be kept under lock and key. I studied the manuscript itself, vellum pages bound in cracked leather, the ink browned like blood that had learned restraint. In the margin of one folio, Charnock had written a single word, betrayal. It struck me as less commentary than confession. The missing page, according to the catalogue, had contained a cryptic dedication, ad corpus et verum. To the body and the truth, the same words as in the crossword. I felt that small flicker of connection, the kind that arrives not as triumph, but as discomfort. Meaning had begun to coil through the case like a thin thread of smoke, visible only in certain light. Lewis suggested that perhaps the page had been stolen for profit. Rare manuscripts, he said, fetched absurd prices, perhaps, but theft requires haste, and whoever removed the page had done so with surgical care, slicing the binding neatly, almost reverently. That was not greed, that was guilt. We left the library just as the rain ceased. The quadrangle glistened with puddles, each one a small mirror of the grey sky. As we crossed beneath the arch, I paused. The porter had mentioned a scarf found that morning, damp but not soaked, hanging from the gate's ironwork. Charnock's scarf, the librarian said he had forgotten. It was a simple detail, unworthy of notice except that the night of the murder had been dry until dawn. Lewis was halfway to the car when he turned and asked what I was thinking. I told him only that the dead, when they mean to be heard, often whisper through the unlikeliest mediums a crossword, a misquoted poet, a misplaced scarf. He smiled wearily and said he preferred fingerprints. I told him they were merely the body's way of leaving behind a footnote. That evening, back in my room, I laid out the photocopy of the register, the crossword, and a photograph of the missing folio's binding. 3 absences pretending to be evidence. I poured a whiskey, the colour of old varnish, and listened to the rain return. The page was missing, yes, but the hand that removed it had left something better than proof. It had left an intention, and in Oxford, intention is the most eloquent form of confession. The letter arrived without fanfare, no return address, no handwriting I recognized, only my name written in the kind of ink that bleeds slightly at the edges. It had been delivered to the station that morning, though Lewis claimed it looked more like a relic than a message. I took it home unopened, left it on the kitchen table beside the whiskey glass from the night before, and told myself I would read it after dinner. Of course, I didn't wait that long. Inside was a single sheet of paper, written in Latin, an elegant slanting hand, the sort that belongs to people who still think words can disguise emotion. I translated it slowly, though the phrasing was peculiar, almost intimate. It spoke of forgiveness, of betrayal born from truth, of the danger of scholars who worship their own minds. The final line caught my attention: inter verbum et corpus peccatum latet. Between word and body, sin hides. I could not decide if it was a confession or an accusation. Lewis arrived not long after, looking damp and unconvinced by the intellectual humidity of the case. He asked what it meant, and I told him it was a kind of riddle, half theology, half despair. He said, "That sounds about right for Oxford." We traced the paper to a shop in Broad Street that still sold stationery by the ream. The owner remembered selling that exact parchment to a woman, though not recently. When pressed, he said, she had an air of grief about her, which in Oxford is hardly a distinguishing feature. I asked if she'd worn gloves. He said yes, the kind with pearl buttons. It was unnecessary detail, yet it stuck with me. The letter, I decided, was not written by a stranger. It was written by someone accustomed to restraint. That evening I went to see Harriet Vane. Her room faced the river, and the window was open to the smell of wet willow. She greeted me with a kind of guarded calm, as though already rehearsing her defense. I showed her the letter. She read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it on the mantelpiece. She said she knew nothing of it, though her voice trembled not with guilt, but with memory. She spoke instead of Charnock's loneliness, his arrogance, the slow corrosion of a man who believed scholarship could excuse cruelty. He had loved knowledge more than people, she said, and when people disappointed him, he retreated into his own riddles. I asked what he regretted most. She answered, without hesitation, the truth he chose to tell too late. There was a pause, the kind that lingers like the aftermath of music. She turned toward the window, watching a barge slip through the rain. She said softly that she had once written him a letter to a letter never sent, in which she forgave him for the wrong he would not admit. When she looked back at me, her eyes carried that dull brilliance of someone who has lived too long inside her own sorrow. As she poured wine, I noticed the pearl buttons on her gloves resting on the table beside her. It was a small detail, but the sort that insists on being remembered. I said nothing. Deduction, I've found, is rarely about answers. It is about the patience to let coincidence prove itself false. On the way back, the city was hushed, its pavements shining under the lamplight. I stopped outside the post office near the high street. In the bin beside the red pillar box, a torn envelope had been discarded. The handwriting matched the letters, the ink bleeding faintly through the paper. I fished it out, ignoring the curious glance of a passing student. The address was never mine. It was written by Charnock. Later, in my room, I compared the ink, the pressure of the pen, and the angle of the strokes. Identical. The letter had not been written to me at all. It had been redirected, delivered to me through error, or perhaps intention. Between word and body, sin hides. The phrase returned to me like a whisper through an open window. I placed the letter beneath the crossword from his desk. The word intersecting corpus was still betrayal. I began to wonder if betrayal was ever a single actor, merely the echo of something long rehearsed. The night deepened. I poured another whiskey and watched the paper curl slightly in the heat of the lamp. I thought of Harriet's hands, her measured calm, the tremor beneath it. I thought of Charnock, translating sin into syntax. Oxford slept outside, quiet as parchment. I folded the letter again, slid it back into its envelope, and told myself I would deliver it in the morning, but I knew even then that it had already reached its destination. For a brief, deceptive span of hours, I thought I had solved it. There is a peculiar satisfaction in believing one's mind has achieved symmetry when the pieces align. The world feels almost forgivable. That afternoon, Lewis and I stood beneath the drizzle outside Sir Adrian Fox's townhouse on Holywell Street, and I was sure the truth waited behind the brass door knocker, polished to ecclesiastical shine. Inside, the air was perfumed with cigars and regret. Fox was courteous in the way men become when they believe civility will suffice as innocence. He poured whiskey with excessive care, his hand too steady. The decanter caught the light like an ornament of confession. He spoke of Charnock's genius, of how envy and isolation so often stalk the scholarly. Every phrase was perfectly measured, every pause deliberate, as though rehearsed from a libretto of self-preservation. He admitted to meeting Charnock on the night of his death, an editorial discussion, nothing more. A glass of port, a disagreement, a farewell. I asked when they parted. He said midnight. The same hour I knew the pathologist had given for the moment Charnock's pulse ceased. The symmetry pleased me, too much perhaps. Lewis found traces of digitalis in the professor's wineglass, and that to my impatient mind was that. Fox had a motive. The manuscript promised to expose his manipulation of the text, his theft of translation. He had meant access to the rooms, to the port. He had even the temperament-controlled, elegant, and deeply afraid of scandal. I laid it all out for Lewis in the car, while the rain pressed against the windscreen with the gentle insistence of doubt. He looked unconvinced, though out of politeness rather than conviction. He said, "So he poisoned the port, waited till the old man drank it, then locked the room from inside somehow." I told him we'd find the method soon enough. He said he hoped so because it all sounded tidy enough to be wrong. Back at the station I wrote the report. The words came easily, too easily, a crime reduced to grammar, cause and effect, motive, opportunity, conclusion. I poured myself another whiskey to celebrate the illusion of closure. For a moment, Oxford seemed quieter, as though it too were satisfied. It was past midnight when the phone rang. The pathologist again. He sounded apologetic, almost amused. The traces in the glass were indeed digital, but inactive, degraded by exposure. Harmless. Charnock had not been poisoned. He had died of natural causes of heart failure, most likely. Or so it appeared. I thanked him, replaced the receiver, and sat for a long time without moving. The symmetry collapsed. I thought of the crossword on Charnock's desk, the intersecting words corpus and betrayal, and realized I had done precisely what the murderer, if there was one, wanted me to do. I had settled too soon. The next morning I returned to the college. Rain had washed the flagstones clean, though the air still tasted faintly of iron. The porter greeted me with that cautious friendliness Oxford reserves for those investigating its secrets. He mentioned a letter found in the waste bin outside the professor's staircase, a page torn from a diary, soaked and illegible except for a single phrase he will know soon. I asked to keep it. In Charnock's rooms the gramophone had been rewound by some dutiful hand, its needle resting in silence. I stood beside the desk again, tracing the faint circle of condensation left by the glass of port. There was no bitterness now, only the ghost of sweetness. I leaned closer. Beneath the rim, on the polished wood, was a fine crescent scratch. I hadn't noticed it before. A trick of the light, perhaps. But I thought of the gramophone needle, its curved metal arm, the precise semicircle it travelled. As music ended, it had been moved after death, or perhaps during it. Lewis joined me, yawning, holding 2 coffees that steamed like penitents. I told him Fox was innocent. He looked startled, then relieved, then confused. I said nothing more. The words felt unnecessary. The false solution had served its purpose. It had cleared the ground for the real question, the one that lingers still if Fox did not kill Charnock. Why had someone gone to such care to make it seem he had? That night, as the city dissolved again into rain, I found myself walking aimlessly toward Christchurch Meadow. The lamps trembled in the puddles, reflecting the kind of truth one cannot touch. I thought of Charnock's manuscript, of Harriet's eyes when she lied, of the phrase that haunted every clue, corpus the body or the truth. I decided then that I was done with bodies for the night. Truth, however, was far from finished with me. It was the choir boy who changed everything, not through intention children seldom mean to, but through the innocent cruelty of memory. I found him one grey morning, perched on the low wall by the chapel, swinging his legs, the hem of his cassock brushing the wet stone. Lewis had been the one to suggest we speak to him. He said that boys notice things adults overlook. He was right, though not in the way he expected. The boy's name was Peter, 11, perhaps 12, the sort of child who looks both younger and older depending on the light. He told me that on the night Professor Charnock died, he had been sent to fetch a bottle of wine from the senior common room. The Reverend had promised him 6pence for his trouble. He said the professor had been alone when he delivered it, sitting by the gramophone, listening to music. I asked what kind of music. He shrugged and said the kind that made you feel sorry for yourself. He remembered too that as he left, he heard the record stop. Then a moment later, start again, but softer this time. He had thought nothing of it. I, on the other hand, felt something cold move behind my ribs. If the gramophone had restarted, someone must have been there to do it. The boy also mentioned that the curtains were drawn, though it was only dusk. That small detail caught my attention. Charnock had hated closed curtains. He once said they made a room feel like a confession box. It was a remark I recalled from a dinner months earlier, one of those tedious faculty gatherings where truth hides behind the silverware. After the boy left, Lewis looked pleased. He said, "There you have it. Someone was in the room after the boy delivered the wine. It proves murder." I told him it proved only that the record was played twice. He frowned, muttered that I was impossible, and went to fetch coffee. When he was gone, I stood alone in the chapel, the scent of candle wax and polish surrounding me like an old hymn. The choir began to rehearse, their voices drifting through the nave in pure, indifferent harmony. I have never trusted perfection. It always hides a compromise. The sound pulled me back to Charnock's rooms in my mind, the gramophone's abrupt pause, the restart, the record itself. Mozart, I recalled, one of the late adagios. Music for men who have lived too long inside their own intellect. I pictured the professor rising to lift the needle, then stopping mid-gesture, perhaps interrupted by a knock, or perhaps by guilt. I walked to the vestry where the Reverend kept his vestments. The place smelt of incense and damp linen. A small shelf held hymnals, each numbered in ink. One volume was missing, number 14. I remembered seeing the same number, penciled in the corner of a page from Charnock's notebook, beside a Latin phrase I had not yet translated. Coincidence, perhaps. Oxford runs on coincidence. But when I opened another hymnal at random, a folded scrap of paper fell out, a torn photograph, its edges browned by time. 3 figures in collegiate robes, Charnock, the Reverend, and a woman half turned away from the camera. Only half her face was visible, but it was enough. Harriet Vane, Lewis, returned with coffee just as I slipped the photograph into my coat pocket. He asked what I had found. I told him nothing worth mentioning. Some truths, I have learned, need to ripen in silence. That night I replayed the boy's account again and again in my mind. The wine, the record, the drawn curtains, the small mechanical click as the needle returned to its cradle. Every death has a rhythm, and this one was set to music. I poured a whiskey and stood by the window of my room, watching the lamps along the high street blur in the rain. I thought of the boy, his legs swinging above the stone, the untroubled honesty of his voice. He had told me the truth, and yet it had deceived me. Truth often does. Before I went to bed, I wrote a single note in my notebook beneath the heading Charnock Music, started twice. Curtain drawn, photograph out in confession. Then I closed the book and turned out the light. The choir's voices still lingered somewhere in the back of my mind, repeating their melody, pure, unbroken, and unbearably human. It was late afternoon when I went to see the Reverend Gwilym. The rain had ceased, though the air still trembled with its memory. The chapel stood empty, a cavern of fading incense and echoing wood. I found him in his study, a small square room behind the vestry, lit by a single lamp and the dying embers of a fire. He was bent over a ledger, but when I entered, he looked up with that peculiar mixture of relief and dread reserved for men who have waited too long to be found out. He said I had come for answers. I told him I had come for honesty, which was not the same thing. He gestured for me to sit, though I remained standing. I have always found that confession prefers imbalance. Truth emerges more readily when one man stands and the other cannot. He began with the familiar prelude of self-deprecation. He was, he said, a weak man, a fallible servant of faith, too trusting of intellect, too fearful of exposure. I told him that weakness and faith were old bedfellows in Oxford. He gave a faint, grateful smile, and then the mask cracked. He and Charnock had worked together years as collaborators on the Corpus manuscript before its rediscovery had made Charnock's name and broken Gwilym's. The translation they produced had been a shared labour, but when the university chose to publish, only one name appeared on the title page, Gwilym's. He had altered a passage subtly, surgically, to obscure Charnock's more heretical interpretation. He claimed he had done so to protect the college from scandal, but his eyes betrayed him. He had done it for survival. When Charnock discovered the deceit, their friendship decayed into threat, and recrimination. The corpus riddle, that was what they called it, half in jest contained a confession disguised as scholarship. Its final page, the missing page, revealed the forgery. Charnock had intended to expose it in his founder's lecture. Instead, he had died. The Reverend's voice broke as he described finding the body. He had gone to the professor's rooms that night, he said, to plead for mercy. He found Charnock slumped over the desk, the gramophone still spinning its slow orbit of Mozart. He thought the man was asleep until he touched his hand. It was cold, yet not stiff. There was still warmth in the fingers. He had panicked, locked the inner door. I took the manuscript from the table and fled. Not to conceal a murder, he insisted upon that, but to hide his own guilt. Lewis would have interrupted, asked for time, for details, for proof. I did not. Proof is rarely proof. I wanted to know only why he had returned to the room later, as the boy had heard, to restart the record, to draw the curtains, to shape the tableau of solitude. He said he had wanted Charnock's death to look like peace. It was the only kindness left to give. For a while, neither of us spoke. The fire made small, conciliatory sounds. I looked around the study, the shelves of theology, the framed photograph of Ordination Day, the solitary glass of port untouched beside a prayer book. There is a certain irony in Oxford, even if sin is catalogued with precision. At last, I asked about the photograph I had found in the hymnal. He looked startled, then resigned. "Harriet," he whispered. We were all young once. She had been Charnock's muse, then mine, then no one's. He had loved her mind, I her mercy. I do not know which of us was the greater fool. Outside, the evening light had thinned to silver. I rose to leave, but he caught my sleeve with trembling fingers. He said that if I believed he had killed Charnock, I was mistaken. The man had died by his own hand. He insisted on shame, or of triumph. He was no longer certain which. When I stepped back into the quadrangle, the chapel bell began to toll for evensong. Its sound was both prayer and punishment. I walked slowly toward the gate, the Reverend's words circling in my mind like smoke. If Charnock's death was self-inflicted, why the elaborate staging? Why the forgery of a library record? Why is the missing page still unseen? By the time I reached the street, the first drops of rain had returned, gentle, almost apologetic. I paused beneath the college archway and looked back once. The chapel windows glowed faintly through the mist, their light soft as absolution. I have often wondered since whether confession brings peace to the confessor or merely transfers the burden to its listener. If so, the Reverend Gwilym had succeeded. I carried his sin out with me that night and, despite whiskey and reason, have never quite set it down. I returned to the station that night with a sense of completion I did not trust. The Reverend's confession had tied the threads too neatly, and I have never believed in tidy endings. They belong to sermons, not to life. The manuscript was still missing its page, the photograph still incomplete, and somewhere between the words of confession and the silences that followed, something continued to breathe. Lewis had gone home, grateful for early rest. I envied him that uncomplicated fatigue, the kind that dissolves with sleep. For me, rest is an arithmetic that never balances. I poured a measure of whiskey and sat with the crossword from Charnock's desk, the paper limp now from handling. The word corpus intersected with betrayal, as before. But one clue had escaped me until that moment, a second truth shadowed by its twin. I had thought of it as a metaphor once, now I wasn't so sure. By morning the rain had stopped. Oxford woke under a sky pale as parchment. I walked to the library again, not for the manuscripts this time, but for the echo of them. The librarian was absent, leaving her desk neat as a confession scrubbed clean. I found the logbook still open where it had been left. Charnock's signature, copied, not written, looked paler than ever. It occurred to me that a man who forged a time might also forge a purpose. What if Charnock's final act had been not despair but design? Harriet Vane was waiting outside when I left. She looked drawn, her face thinner than before, the kind of thinness that comes from resisting emotion rather than hunger. She said she had been to the chapel. Gwilym had preached a sermon on forgiveness, though she suspected the words were for himself. Then she handed me a small envelope. It had slipped under her door that morning, the handwriting hers. She looked bewildered. I opened it. Inside was a half-page of parchment, edges frayed, the ink faded but legible. It began with a phrase in Latin I had seen before, ad corpus et verum, to the body and the truth. Beneath it, a second line written in a different hand, he who hides one betrays both. I asked how it came to her. She shook her head. Perhaps the Reverend returned it, she said, or perhaps Charnock never sent it at all. I asked if she had written to him after his death. She looked away. Once, she said, but the letter was never posted. It was found, I believe, among his papers. I told her that the forgery in the library register might have been hers. She did not deny it. She said she had gone there that night after learning of his death. She had wanted to see the manuscript to destroy the evidence of Gwilym's deceit, but when she arrived the room was already dark, the curtains drawn, the gramophone silent. She saw the body and fled. The next morning, guilt had driven her back to make it appear as though Charnock had come to the library himself. She wanted to protect the Reverend, not deceive the police. There was truth in her voice, though I could not tell whose it served. We walked across the quadrangle in silence. The cobblestones were still damp, reflecting the morning's light like fragments of thought. At the gate, she stopped. She said Charnock had once told her that every translation was a kind of betrayal, that to seek truth through language was to kill the original meaning. She wondered aloud if that applied to love as well. Then she smiled, a small, tired smile, and walked away. Later, back at my room, I examined the parchment under a magnifying glass. The Latin was written in two inks, one old, one fresh. The newer line was written in Charnock's hand. I compared it with the crossword letters, and the resemblance was exact. He had left a second riddle, not in translation, but in confession. He who hides one betrays both. I thought of the Reverend hiding the page, of Harriet hiding the truth, of myself hiding the growing suspicion that there had been no murderer at all, only the slow decay of conscience. That evening, Lewis came with news that the pathologist had revised his findings again. The heart failure was genuine, but it had been hastened by digitalis taken willingly, self-administered. I nodded, though the answer brought no peace. A suicide, perhaps, or something subtler death arranged like a puzzle no one deserved to solve. As night fell, I returned to the chapel. The choir was practicing the same adagio Charnock had played before he died. The music rose softly into the rafters, trembling like a question that had forgotten its origin. I sat in the last pew, listening, until the final note dissolved into the air. I left the parchment on the lectern beside the open Bible. Beneath it, I wrote a single word on a slip of paper, verum. Truth. Then I walked out into the misted quadrangle where the lamps were flickering to life and the stones glistened as though newly washed of sin. There are nights when Oxford feels like a dream imagined by someone already dead. The air too still, the streets too careful, the light on the stone too soft to belong to the living. That night was one of them. I remember walking through the gates of Corpus Christi with the parchment still folded in my coat pocket, the bells marking 9 with that peculiar melancholy peculiar to Anglican certainty. The Reverend's sermon was long finished, but I could still hear its echo through the chapel walls, something about redemption, something about mercy. I did not go there for mercy. I went for the body and for the truth, though by then I had begun to suspect they were the same thing. The chapel was empty when I entered, save for the faint smell of extinguished candles and rain-wet stone. The altar gleamed softly beneath the lamps. I walked up the central aisle, the sound of my shoes echoing faintly off the wood. I stopped where the choir boys usually stood, and for a moment I imagined the voices again, their notes ascending like absolution denied. It was there, behind the altar, that I found the small door slightly ajar, the one that led to the vestry storage. Inside, among the vestments and hymnals, sat a narrow trunk I had not seen before. It bore the university seal, and beneath the latch was a small, almost imperceptible smear of ink. I lifted the lid. The missing manuscript rested inside, its cover, warped slightly by moisture, its binding cut cleanly where the final page had once been removed. And underneath it, folded with almost ritual precision, was the stolen page itself. I do not remember sitting down, but I must have. The page was written in Latin, the handwriting firm but uneven, as though the author's hand had trembled near the end. It was no theological treatise, no confession of doctrine or heresy. It was rather a statement of guilt, not of murder, but of deceit. Charnock had falsified his translation, not to obscure another's work, but to protect his own reputation from the revelation that he had been wrong. He had spent his life searching for a truth he could claim, and when it eluded him, he created one. The body of scholarship, corrupted to preserve the illusion of the scholar. At the bottom of the page was a final line, added later, in a different hand. Harriet's. I recognized the tilt of her letters, the careful spacing. It read, simply, "He forgave himself too soon." I sat there a long while, the truth slowly dulling into understanding. Charnock had not been poisoned. He had not been betrayed. He had died, as so many scholars do, by his own intellect. The Digitalis was not an act of desperation, but of composition. He had written his own ending with the precision of a classicist, arranging the scene so that those who came after him would read the death as mystery, not confession. His final manuscript had been the room itself. I thought of the record that had stopped and started again. It had not been a sign of intrusion, as I once believed. He had simply lifted the needle to replay the passage he loved most. A quiet repetition before silence. Lewis arrived soon after, his coat glistening with rain, his expression that of a man summoned to tragedy too often to expect surprise. He asked if I had found what I was looking for. I told him I had found enough. He asked if that meant the case was closed. I said that Oxford never truly closes anything, it merely shelves it under another name. We locked the manuscript in the evidence cabinet and left the college in silence. The rain had begun again, fine and insistent. At the gate he stopped and asked whether I pitied Charnock. I said I did, though perhaps not for the reasons he imagined. Pity is a form of understanding, and understanding is a dangerous kind of mercy. Later, alone in my room, I poured a final whiskey and set the crossword from Charnock's desk beside the recovered page. Corpus intersected with betrayal, as before, but now I saw what he had meant. The word corpus had not referred to the college, nor even to the body in its literal sense. It was the manuscript itself, the corpus of his life's work. And betrayal, the final word he had written, was not accusation, but admission. I thought of Harriet's line again. He forgave himself too soon. Perhaps she was right. Or perhaps he had not forgiven himself at all, merely sought a form of punishment too elegant to be mistaken for despair. Outside, the bells began again, calling the faithful to nothing in particular. I stood by the window and watched the rain trace thin, hesitant paths down the glass. In the distance, the spire of Corpus seemed to shimmer, as though uncertain whether to exist at all. I have often wondered what truth demands of those who seek it. Perhaps the Reverend was right. Truth and mercy are adversaries, not allies. Or perhaps Charnock's death proved something simpler, that the pursuit of truth is its own undoing, and that the body fallible, transient, and human is the only truth worth keeping. I finished the whiskey, folded the crossword into the drawer, and turned out the light. Somewhere in the city, the choir began to sing again. Their voices rose, weightless and pure, and for a moment Oxford felt forgiven. It was a mild morning in early March when the college gathered for the Founders' Lecture. The kind of morning Oxford pretends is spring, though the air still carries winter's chill, like a memory it refuses to relinquish. The quadrangle had been swept, the flag hoisted, and the windows of the hall glowed with an optimism that felt faintly dishonest. I arrived late, as I usually do to ceremonies that promise closure. Inside the hall was a theatre of expectation. The dons had assembled in their formal gowns, faces composed in that curious mix of reverence and boredom peculiar to academics. The smell of wax, damp wool, and old port lingered. At the far end, beneath the painted likeness of the college's founder, a lectern waited, polished, severe, a pulpit for the living to make peace with the dead. Harriet Vane sat in the front row. She had chosen black, though there was no rule demanding it. Her posture was still, her expression unreadable. When she caught sight of me at the back, she looked away, which was the kindest thing she could have done. The speaker was a young fellow Dr. Adrian Bell, newly appointed and already sufficiently ambitious to make the occasion about himself. His subject, truth and transcription in early humanist scholarship. A title, I suspected, chosen less for insight than for safety. He spoke fluently and too long, as though the weight of Charnock's ghost required extra verbiage to suppress. His words drifted through the hall like incense, sweet, decorative, and finally forgettable. I watched the audience instead, the bursar staring fixedly at his shoes, the chaplain's hands trembling faintly on his prayer book, and Harrietha, gaze unmoving, anchored on the window beyond the lectern, where rain had begun to trace pale streaks against the glass. She was listening, but not to the lecture. The Reverend Gwilym was absent. He had left Oxford the previous evening, on indefinite retreat. The message he sent to Lewis was brief, almost clerical. I have found peace. Pray that it endures. I could not tell if it was an apology or a verdict. When the applause came, it sounded tired, like an echo rehearsed in advance. The master stood to thank the speaker and to remind the assembly that truth is the cornerstone of our college. I almost laughed. In Oxford, truth is seldom a cornerstone. It is an ornament, polished for display, admired from a distance. Afterward, there was sherry. The talk turned to weather, endowments, and the cricket season. Lewis, who had endured the morning with admirable patience, appeared at my side and asked if it was all over now. I told him it never is. Cases end, yes, but endings are not closure. He looked puzzled and asked what I meant. I said nothing. Some lessons are wasted in daylight. Before leaving, I walked once more through the cloisters. The air smelled of rain and lilac, and somewhere nearby a pigeon cooed with bureaucratic persistence. On the notice board, pinned between a Latin tutorial and a concert announcement, hung a thin sheet of parchment, a reproduction of the recovered page from the Corpus Riddle, its translation printed neatly beneath: to the body, the truth; to the truth, the silence; no attribution, no fanfare. Just there, quietly waiting to be ignored. I found myself reading the line over and over, unable to decide whether Charnock had written it as confession or warning. Perhaps both, perhaps neither. That evening, I went to Randolph. Lewis joined me briefly before leaving for his wife's birthday. He asked if I was certain Charnock had meant to die. I told him certainty is a word for sermons, not for detectives. He said I was becoming sentimental. I told him sentimentality was just logic with better lighting. He laughed, and for a moment, the case felt like history. When I returned home, I poured a final drink and opened my notebook. The crossword from Charnock's desk still lay there, folded neatly beside Harriet's letter. I studied the intersecting words once more: corpus and betrayal. The ink had faded, but not enough to hide the faint smudge at the crossing point, as though a fingertip had lingered too long. I thought of that hand, steadying itself in the half-light, and wondered whether it had trembled from guilt or relief. Outside, Oxford lay hushed beneath the drizzle, its lamps blurring into soft halos along the cobblestones. Somewhere, a choir rehearsed for evensong, their voices carrying through the mist. I listened until the notes dissolved into the night, each one receding into silence. That was the last time I heard Charnock's name spoken in the college. Yet, sometimes, when the bells of Corpus strike midnight, I imagine him still there in that room, by the gramophone, lifting the needle once more to replay the same mournful passage. Not seeking redemption, not even forgiveness, but only the quiet company of his own unfinished truth.